Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, a special for St. Patrick's Day. And I thought, given St. Patrick's Day, number one, I'd wear green, and number two, I'd have a Canadian Irish or Irish Canadian history expert and an author, someone from Ireland who's been writing about Irish Canadian history and politics, and done doing that both from a fiction standpoint as well as a factual nonfiction standpoint for numerous years. And David's got really quite an impressive background. He was born in Island County Antrim in Ireland in a farmer's cottage without electricity or running water. And he's now a professor at the Department of History at U of T. David Wilson, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
So I want to talk about, some of the work that you've done, some of the academic work you've done, some of the books that you've read. But maybe we could just tell everyone, if you could, off the top, what's the background to St. Patrick's Day, and why is it one of those things that everyone likes to celebrate?
Well, it really stems from the Irish diaspora. Everything that we associate now with St. Patrick's Day comes from the movement, the emigration of Irish people throughout the world, bringing their traditions with them, bringing their conflicts with them, and bringing their memories with them, and bringing their patron saint as well. So the St. Patrick's Day parades actually got going among Irishmen in the army, in the British Army, and in colonial America as well. And as the movement of Irish people changed in the 19th century from being a predominantly Protestant migration to a predominantly Catholic one overall throughout the diaspora, St. Patrick's Day parades became increasingly associated with Catholicism and in many places with Irish nationalism as well. Now, this is an interest, and of course, communal festivities and communal conflicts. So there was a lot of celebration, a lot of drinking, some fighting. St. Patrick's Day was known for that as well in various locations, including Canada. Within Ireland itself, the tradition was quite different. In Ireland, St. Patrick's Day was a holy day. The pubs were closed. This was not to be a day of wild revelry. It was a day for quiet, sober religious reflection. And that began to change in the 1970s and 1980s, largely as primarily North American tourists came to Ireland.
Expected a party.
Irish ethnicity, expecting a party and finding that the pubs were closed. Well, the Irish are certainly a pragmatic people, and they saw the opportunity there. So they began to organize St. Patrick's Day parades, and the pubs began to open, and they made a financial killing out of this. And the St. Patrick's Day parades continue now in Ireland as well as throughout the diaspora. But they were also quite different in character even then, and even more recently, in that St. Patrick's Day parade, say in Boston, took on the coloration of an earlier form of Irish Catholicism that was conservatively Catholic, whereas Ireland was becoming rapidly secularized in the 1990s and the early 2000s. So you would find, for example, that gay floats were banned in the St. Patrick's Day parades in Boston, but were celebrated in Cork and Dublin. So there's been a very interesting switch. And in that respect, looking at St. Patrick's Day parades in general can give you a really good snapshot of cultural and social and religious developments in Ireland and throughout the English-speaking world, wherever Irish, or indeed throughout the world, wherever Irish people traveled.
Well, I got to tell you one story. I was in Dublin during the foot and mouth disease, which I think was about 20, 22 years ago. I can't remember exactly when. And they had delayed St. Patrick's Day because of foot and mouth disease in the parade. And they actually, ironically, had it on our Victoria Day. And I was there, and the parade was spectacular. All the pubs were open, and people were drinking absolutely everywhere. And it was one of the best events I've ever been at. It was certainly the best parade I've ever been at. And we did a great pub crawl. So that was a fun experience for me. Let's go back, if we could, to sort of the different series of Irish immigration into Canada, because I didn't realize that first there were Protestant immigration and then Catholic immigration. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that history. My family is actually Scottish, but we came from Ireland. And so there were a whole bunch of people that went from Scotland and went to Ireland because of whatever famines that occurred in Scotland. And then they went to Ireland, and they went from Ireland to Canada. So tell me a little bit about the waves of immigration and why it changed, if you could, and why it happened. We always hear about potato famine. I think that was, one of the reasons, but I think it also came a lot during the Troubles, where people left Ireland as well.
Well, yes, there are many reasons for immigration changing over time. And when I spoke about the migration becoming increasingly Catholic, that's on a global basis from the 1830s onwards. But so before the famine, which was in the 1840s, the late 1840s. In Canada, the pattern is quite distinct, and I should say patterns, because there are different streams. For example, Newfoundland. Now, Newfoundland is an example of Irish Catholic migration that began in the 17th and 18th centuries. And this is a very interesting case because this was involved, clearly involved with provisioning the fisheries and directly in the fisheries. And Irish people from the southeast of the country, from Waterford and Wexford, would go to Newfoundland for the summer for the fishing and drying the fish and so on, and then would start wintering over. And a very distinct kind of Irish culture developed in Newfoundland in relative separation from other ethnic influences. So you find that a lot of Irish traditions, including the Irish accent from Southeast Ireland, carries over into Newfoundland, and a sense of humor carries over. And the dancing in Newfoundland, the Irish dancing in Newfoundland, was much wilder and freer than the dancing that the priests got hold of in Ireland in the 19th century. The pelvis must never move, and the arms must be straight down the side, and people shouldn't touch. But before the so-called devotional revolution, the tightening up of Catholicism in Ireland, dancing was pretty wild, and that was carried over into Newfoundland as well. And then really Irish migration numerically really gets underway after the Napoleonic War. So we're looking post 1815. And Canada is quite different from the United States in this respect, because in Canada, the majority of Irish immigrants came before the famine, and the majority of them were Protestant. Now, this meant, among other things, that the Irish became the largest single ethnic group in Canada between about 1820 and 1870, larger than the English and Scots and Welsh combined.
Really?
Yeah, and largely a Protestant group. More Catholics started to come in
And
the
that was
18th.
primarily in what, Upper Canada or across Canada?
That was in Upper Canada / Ontario. It was about 66% Protestant, 33% Catholic. In Canada as a whole, it was about 60% Protestant and 40% Catholic. People. This is from 1871, the census, which was the first census to measure ethnicity and cross-tabulate it with religion. This is pretty solid stuff. So, so it's the story you tell of your ancestors who came from Scotland to Ireland and then to Canada is actually a very common story in Irish Canadian history. I don't know when your ancestors came over, but I can tell you that migration to Canada from Ireland really dried up from about the mid 1850s. Not dried up completely, but it dwindled to a trickle. And there were good reasons for that. You know, the word was getting back to the folks in Ireland that the best land in Ontario, in particular, had been taken up. Manitoba hadn't really been opened up by this stage, but Australia was opening up, and so the same migratory stream that was going to Canada after the mid 1850s switched to Australia. And you can actually trace that in some detail by looking at particular communities and seeing the shifts that occurred. Now, the famine migration was massive. In 1847, 109,000 Irish people came to British North America. Most came into Quebec and through the St. Lawrence system. About 9,000 went to St. John, New Brunswick, and 90% of them, or even more, went straight down to New England. St. John was basically a you know
Stopping off point.
a stop en route to New England, because in 1847 it was cheaper to get to Canada by boat than it was to the United States. So we have 100,000 people coming in during the famine. Now, about 80% of them are Catholic and about 20% are Protestant. But the interesting thing is that about 90% of those famine migrants moved straight through Canada into the industrial heartland of the American Midwest. That's where they went to Buffalo and Chicago.
So they didn't stay in Canada.
Most of them didn't. Henry Ford, by the way, was one of the people in those among those 100. Henry Ford's comes from the 100,000 who emigrated through Canada in 1847. And so you get Detroit, you get Buffalo, you get Chicago, and of course some of them went to New York as well, and others became farmers. But this is very interesting because if you look at the ethnic balance, the ratio between Catholics and Protestants before the famine and after the famine in Ontario, it's the same. It's about a third Catholic, two-thirds Protestant before the famine, a third Catholic, two-thirds Protestant after the famine. And we have to remember this, of this 100,000 who came in during the famine, probably about 40,000 would have been coming anyway. And so those who stayed were generally those who had connections, not always, but most of them had some kind of family connection, people who could look after them, kin networks, that kind of thing,
right,
to help them get through.
That's interesting because I really thought that the famine was the cause of the vast majority of Irish people in Canada, and what you're saying is that's not the case.
It's not the case.
We got to take a break for some messages. We're going to come back, and I'm going to ask the professor a little bit about other waves, particularly the Troubles, and maybe he can tell us a little bit about what the Troubles were, and did that cause another wave of immigration? Stay with us, everyone. It's St. Patrick's Day, and we're honoring the Irish by learning a little bit more about Irish Canadians with our expert professor from U of T, David Wilson. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on St. Patrick's Day. And we've got David Wilson, a professor at the University of Toronto in the history department, an expert, obviously, on Irish Canadian issues with us as our guest tonight. He was born in Island McGee County, Antrim Island, a farmer's cottage with electricity and running water, and established himself, he says, as a true Celt. He moved with his family to England, where he resisted education in a variety of schools before being fired as a bus conductor, living in a commune in Cardiff, and hitchhiking in Western Europe. Now, it sounds like we could talk for a while just on that story. He went to university in York. He dropped out, went back again, and eventually received his BA, emigrated to Canada, got his MA, his PhD at Queen's University, etc. And then he went to St. Lawrence University, Queen's University, and St. Thomas University, where he joined the Irish Studies at Queen's University, Belfast. He couldn't get, he says, a permanent job. He was unwilling to spend the rest of his life going from one appointment to another appointment. So he came back to Canada, where he prepared and presented radio documentaries with CBC's Ideas series. While there, he applied for a position in the University of Toronto History Department, taught for 3 years before moving to the Celtic Studies program at St. Michael's College. In 2013, he was invited to become the general editor of the Dictionary of Canadian Biography and has been working there ever since. As I mentioned, he's got a PhD at Queen's University, Kingston, an MA, and a BA He last year, no, sorry, 2 years ago, got the award of the Person of the Year award for exceptional contributions to Irish-Canadian relations. He's got numerous other awards. He's just released a book called The Canadian Spy Story, Irish Revolutions and the Secret Police. And he's got numerous other books behind him. Irish and Scottish Encounters with Indigenous People, the Thomas D'Arcy McGee volumes, the Irish Nationalism in Canada, the Orange Order in Canada, etc. What a great expert that we've got. David Wilson, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it. When we left off just before the message breaks, I was asking about the Troubles. And lots of us have heard about, what was going on between Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants. Tell us a little bit about the Troubles and where it came from, what happened, and did it cause immigration to Canada, if you could?
Certainly. You have to go back some way to get the perspective on this. So there was a revolution in Ireland between 1919 and 21 that resulted in, among other things, a civil war in Ireland over the degree of independence from Britain that should be striven for. But within the island of Ireland, Protestants who were predominant in the northeast of the country wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom and were prepared to fight anyone, including the British themselves, who wanted to take them out of the United Kingdom. And to deal with this problem from the British perspective, the solution was to have partition. And to divide up Ireland in such a way that the Protestants in the northeast would have a majority. So actually, we got to two-thirds again. Two-thirds of the population of Northern Ireland was Protestant, and one-third was Catholic, and it was designed to be that way. The idea was to give Protestants security so that they would not be voted out of the United Kingdom by a Catholic majority in those 6 counties in the northeast. This, of course, left the Catholic minority in Northern Ireland in the lurch. They did not want to be part of the United Kingdom for the most part. They wanted to be part of the Irish nation and resisted this as best they could. There had been intermittent campaigns by Irish Catholics in the north, often aided and abetted in the south, and we can get into the degree to which that happened. There have been intermittent campaigns to end partition, unite the country, and deal with the Protestants later, if you like. An IRA campaign Irish Republican Army IRA campaign between 1956 and 62 failed completely to accomplish those goals. But in 1968, the civil rights movement in Ireland got underway. Now, the civil rights movement was inspired in part by Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the southern states of America. And partly by student revolution in Europe, like radical student movements in France, for example. And the idea initially behind the civil rights movement was not to aim for an abolition of the state of Northern Ireland, but to press, as the name suggests, for equal civil rights for Catholics. Now, what did that mean in practice? It meant, for example, changing voting in local governments to make sure that the vote was no longer dependent on property ownership, but on people themselves, to abolish property qualifications for voting. One man, one vote was the way they put it, although they really meant one person, one vote. They wanted to include women as well. And they wanted to end gerrymandering. In which, in places like Derry or Londonderry, even though there was a significant a significant Catholic majority, the city council was actually dominated by Protestants because of the way the electoral boundaries were drawn up. This was very unfair. and it was meant to be unfair if you're a Protestant. I mean, it was meant to keep Protestants in power. So there was a campaign against that. And Protestants in the North, not all, but most Protestants in the North, regarded the Civil Rights Association as a threat uh, because they believed it was a stalking horse for the IRA. And indeed, there were IRA people who helped form this, played a pivotal role in the development of the civil rights movement. But it wasn't an IRA front movement. It had many different strands, many different voices. But there was just enough IRA involvement for Protestants who feared that it was a front organization to be able to point to, well, look at this, a tricolour flag. The Irish flag appears in some of these civil rights demonstrations. This isn't really about civil rights at all. This is about destroying our state. This is about taking us out of the United Kingdom. So there was a backlash against the civil rights marchers, and in some cases, quite a brutal backlash in which unarmed civil rights demonstrators were attacked by mobs and attacked by police within the mob. So it was a very ugly situation, and one that shocked the world in 1968 when TV cameras captured all of this. It shocked many people in England, which is where I was living at the time, who had no idea this kind of thing was going on within the United Kingdom. Um, and it was out of that conflict that the IRA began to re-emerge and radicalize itself, rearm. And for the IRA, the goal was not civil rights. Their argument was you can't get civil rights within what is essentially a gerrymandered state, a sectarian state. The only way you can get justice for Catholics is by abolishing the state, by driving out the British, and assuming that the Protestants will either leave or they'll come to terms with the new reality. And this set in motion a 30 years war with the loss of life of about 3,000 people in a population of roughly 1.5 million. And it meant that just about everyone in the North knew someone who was a casualty in the Troubles. It tore the communities apart even further. It resulted in a compromise which fell far short of the IRA's goals and went further than that which most loyalist Protestants wanted, and actually a compromise that was on offer in 1974 and rejected by both sides, but was finally accepted in 1998. So out of that cauldron, many Irish people, Catholic and Protestant alike, got out. Many went to Britain, many went to Canada, many went to the United States, many went to Australia. So this alters the nature of the Irish Canadian experience in a number of interesting ways. Before then, before the 1970s, shall we say, before then, there was actually not that much interest in matters Irish within Canada, including among people of Irish Canadian ethnicity. And you have, don't take my word for it, take the words of the Irish ambassadors to Canada at that time and read their dispatches, and they're saying they're just not interested in anything that's going on in Ireland. This is before the Troubles. They're just not interested. They don't seem to be too conscious of their ethnicity. That changes radically as more people come in the 1970s and 1980s. It's no coincidence that when St. Patrick's Day parades restart in Toronto, it's in 1988. It's a combination of the people coming in the Troubles and also people coming in to escape the recession in Ireland, particularly the south of Ireland, in the 1980s. That's another driver of Irish emigration. Now, there's a very, very strong Irish Catholic component. I think it's a dominant component of this migration.
In the
Which
Troubles,
means,
or
among
because of the
other
Troubles.
things, that the way Irish Canadian history is interpreted by the people coming in the 1970s and 80s, mainly Irish Catholics, is through an Irish Catholic lens. And so the story of Irish Catholics, which is a very important part of the Canadian story. Don't get me wrong, it's a very important part of the story, but it becomes for many the only story. And what is omitted, among other things, or forgotten, is that for most of Canada's history, the really important Irish institution, and I mean really important, wasn't connected to St. Patrick's Day parades and Irish Catholicism. It was the Orange Order. Now, by the end of this is ultra Protestant, ultra loyalist, ultra anti-Catholic. And by the end of the 19th century, 1 in 3 of adult Protestant males in Canada was a member of the Orange Order, many of whom had no Irish background whatsoever. This was an extraordinary achievement. In Toronto, in 1920, there were 8,000 marchers in the Orange Parade, 20,000 onlookers. 4 years later, the Orange Order thought about buying Casa Loma and turning it into an Orange Lodge. They were, if you're looking for the most influential part of Irish Canadian history, that's where you go. But the perceptions in the 1980s focus much more on the famine migration, which needs to be addressed and needs to be studied. It focuses very much on Irish Catholic experiences, which again need to be addressed and need to be studied. But the spotlight becomes so bright um, uh, as it's directed towards these issues. Other parts of the Irish Canadian historical experience are left in the shade.
That's fascinating that you've got this Orange Parade and the Orange Order versus St. Patrick's Day and Protestant versus Catholic. I've heard stories of people running guns for the IRA in Canada. Did any of this troubles, Catholic versus Protestant, come to Canada?
Oh yes, yes. There was gun running on both sides, Protestants and Catholics, and Toronto was one of the hubs of that. In fact, Montreal was another one. Um, so you mentioned the last book I wrote, Canadian Spy Story, Irish Revolutionaries and the Secret Police, which actually deals with the 1860s and the origins of the Canadian Secret Police Force, and the emergence of an Irish revolutionary nationalist movement within Canada, so Fenians in Canada as well as the United States. And in the course of that research, I wanted to, in the concluding section, just draw some connections with events during the Troubles. Now it's too early to write this history because a lot of the sources that we need have not been released by the government, which is very frustrating for historians all around. But we know enough uh, to say that yes, one of the CSIS people that I spoke to was talking about people in Toronto who went down to the States to buy Stinger missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, to shoot down British Army helicopters.
You're kidding.
No, I'm not. One of them, one who was accused of this and then acquitted on the grounds of entrapment, was actually a senior bank manager in a very, very senior figure in the Toronto banking system. We also know that a company not far from Toronto that was involved in the mining industry was getting detonators for mines and sending them to the IRA to detonate bombs. And indeed, these detonators, I am told, were intercepted by CSIS, the RCMP first and then CSIS, and neutralized. And then repackaged and sent on to the IRA. So this is a little known story, but actually, and it will eventually be better known as more sources come out. That some pubs in Toronto and Montreal were used as safe houses for IRA men on the run. The same thing on the Loyalist side. The Boyne Tavern, which is no longer in existence, which, it's a Main and Danforth, that area. That was a Loyalist center as well. I met some Loyalist ex-paramilitaries who told me directly about their connections with Toronto. Guns were run from Canada to Loyalists often through Scotland, sometimes through the south of England, and then back up a way that the authorities wouldn't expect. They wouldn't expect guns to be coming in from England. Uh, so yes, it has to be said this was a minority activity on both sides, but it did exist, absolutely.
Did the violence happen in Canada, or was it all just exporting it to Ireland?
It was all exported to Ireland. I know of no instances of uh, orange green sort of Protestant Catholic violence within Canada at this time, but I do know that supporters of loyalist paramilitaries and supporters of the IRA were active in Canada.
What a
More active in the
fascinating
United States, but they were active in Canada.
What a fascinating history. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes. And I'm going to talk to our expert about where Ireland is today, because I think Ireland has turned things around from some of the challenges they've had in the past. And Ireland is one of the economic powerhouses in the European community today. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is an expert on Canadian Irish Canadian history. David Wilson is his name. He's a professor in the Department of History at the University of Toronto. He's written numerous different books, numerous different publications. He's got a whole bunch of awards. I'm going to ask you about some of the awards you've got. My gosh, it's incredible. Actually, let me ask you now. In 2000, you got the Outstanding Teacher Award, and in 2023, you got the Person of the Year Award. How do you achieve Outstanding Teacher and Person of the Year?
Well, it was a delightful, both were a delightful surprise, I have to say. I love teaching. I love getting engaged with students. I love discussions. I had a really good seminar with students today on Ireland, race, and empires, looking at Irish racism in the United States and Irish anti-colonialism in the United States. Great discussions. I enjoy giving lectures, and it's made easier by being in a university like the University of Toronto because we have some excellent students here, and it's just a delight to do it. And I work hard at it, I have to say. I mean, I prepare very carefully for my classes. I try and make it look as if I haven't prepared carefully, but I really put a lot of time and effort into that. The Irish Person of the Year was again something that came as a surprise, and it stemmed from the work I did on Thomas D'Arcy McGee. Now, for those who don't,
You got 2 volumes that you've written on Thomas D'Arcy McGee, and I love the title: Passion, Reason, and Politics.
yeah. Yes, that's volume one, and and volume two is the extreme moderate. Uh, Thomas D'Arcy McGee was a fascinating character, brilliant person, the youngest and most intellectually gifted of the Canadian Fathers of Confederation, who in his younger years had been an Irish revolutionary, who had proudly described himself as a traitor to the British government, who had got out by the skin of his teeth from Ireland, from authorities who were going to arrest him for treason. So I thought that was an absolutely fascinating story in and of itself. And he was assassinated as well by a Fenian at the age of 42, just a week before his 43rd birthday. So we have this individual who was a brilliant orator, who was one of the best respected poets of his generation, who was a great writer, had enormous energy, made waves wherever he went, who at various points in his career, and remember, only 42 years, started off his first political speech was given at the age of 17 after he'd gone to the United States. At the age of 19, he becomes editor. At the age of 19, he becomes editor of the most important Irish American newspaper that existed, the Boston Pilot, at the age of 19. Goes back to Ireland, becomes a member of the revolutionary group, the Young Islanders there. He's on the Central Committee of the Irish Confederation, as it's called, that organizes a rising in 1848. it fails, so he escapes to the United States, and then he starts to reevaluate his position, and he revolutions in Ireland have failed repeatedly, and um, perhaps that's the wrong course. And then he becomes increasingly convinced this is the wrong course. And if revolution is impossible, then what you need to do is focus on reforms instead. And if that's your strategy, then revolution is actually going to be counterproductive because you're going to try and get reforms and people think they're going to lead to revolution, like British authorities. You're not going to get them. So he becomes very anti-revolutionary and very pro-reform. At the same time, or a few years later, he becomes converted to, he's always been a Catholic, but he becomes converted to serious Catholicism. Uh, you know, had he lived long enough, he would have strongly agreed with papal infallibility. And this was actually a rebellion against American Protestant culture, which he associated with materialism, with individualism, with loose morals, with celebrity culture, guns on the streets. His critique of America actually has a very modern ring to it.
God, it sounds like I got to get this book.
Yeah. So then he comes to Canada and moderate. He becomes a moderate. Irish Catholics are a minority, and he realizes that as a minority, they're vulnerable. And this is one of the reasons, not the only reason, it's one of the reasons why he does everything he can to counter Fenianism in Canada, both within Canada and outside it, because the more Irish Catholics become associated with disloyalty, the worse life is going to be for them. And so he's and also he wants to demonstrate to the British government that when Irish Catholics are treated well, when they're in a country that doesn't have an established church, when they're in a country that doesn't have landlords who are oppressing them, when they're in a country where they can own their own land, as single most important occupation for Irish Catholics in Canada was in the farming world, which is not the cities. If you can demonstrate to Britain that when Irish Catholics are treated well, they will be loyal, then you have a huge set of cards to play for reform in Ireland. So this is part of Magee's thinking as he also begins to emphasize minority rights. If you're going to try and protect Irish Catholic rights in English-speaking Canada, then you're protecting minority rights and minority educational rights. And in the Confederation movement, in the conferences on Confederation, his major contribution was to enshrine minority rights for education, specifically Catholic education, within the Constitution.
Really?
And he regarded that, he said, this is the first constitution, to my knowledge, that's ever made minority rights a formal guarantee. And I think that was one of his proudest, if not the proudest, accomplishment of his life. So all of this, and then he's assassinated, and his assassination is still a matter of controversy now. Who did it and why? And I wrote extensively on that too. So it was an absolutely fascinating story, and what was going to be a 152-page biography of D'Arcy McGee just developed into a 2-volume book, and it was that actually that then helped start up an annual conference on D'Arcy McGee in Ireland, the Thomas D'Arcy McGee Summer School, which is where I was given the Irish Person of the Year award a couple of years ago, which was with a pipe band in the background. It was brilliant. It was just fantastic.
Fantastic story. Tell us about, if you could, some other famous Irish Canadians.
Well, if you look at people of Irish Canadian birth, you're actually going to find that most of them aren't that famous now because most of them came in the 19th century and they were famous in their time but largely forgotten now. D'Arcy McGee is the big one. There were other figures who were very well known in their time who have been forgotten now. I think of Patrick Boyle, the editor of the Irish Canadian newspaper. I think of Ellen Cashman, an amazing woman from County Cork who wound up in British Columbia and then the goldfields of the Yukon. and she became known as the miner's angel or the angel of the Cassiar. She was a prospector herself, and she was mining in the summer in Cassiar in the far north of BC. Went back to Victoria for the winter, and then learned that scurvy had broken out in the camp. People were starving, so she persuaded 6 men to join her on a 77-day trek through the wilderness in the winter, through snow and storms and sleet and hail and frost and sub-zero temperatures to bring food to the miners in the Cassiar. And she succeeded. So, I mean, she was famous in her time and just an incredible woman. Or someone else who was famous in his time was Charles McKiernan, who was known as Joe Beef, who had this tavern in Montreal, which was the most amazing place. It was a massive operation with vertical integration into farms to get meat for people. He never turned away. He never turned away anyone who needed food. He never turned away anyone who needed a bed. They could get free food and a free bed if they needed it. Drink you had to pay for. You always had to pay for the drink. And he had, I mean, he had a dancing bear chained in the basement. I think that's horrendous, but people loved it at the time. It was and it was regarded by many respectable people in Montreal as an outrage. This is in sort of in
Dancing bear, yes, I can see that that's a bit of an outrage.
Yes, respectable Catholic culture, and you've got this sort of absolute mess. So perhaps notorious would be a better word than famous for him. But if we move forward to people of Irish ethnicity, people of Irish background, well, you get more people than you might expect. I mean, some of the feminists, like Nellie McClung, Irish background, Protestant background, and Lester Pearson is of has Irish Protestant ancestors. Brian Mulrooney, of course, Irish Catholic ancestors. And from all walks of life, doing all kinds of things. The richest man in Canada, the kind of Elon Musk of his time, if you like, was an Irishman, and he was absolutely. His name was Hubert Holt. Herbert Holt, rather, in Montreal. He actually made money during the Depression, which was really hard to do. Whenever he showed up in public at a baseball game, he was booed by French Canadians as a maudit Anglais, even though he was a maudit Irlandais. So you get all kinds of individuals. Charlie Murphy, who was Secretary of State for William Lyon Mackenzie King, who got D'Arcy McGee on the very first to be the very first Irishman to be on a stamp in the world. Postmaster General he became. So you've got, you have so many people from Ireland or of Irish ethnicity whose parents or grandparents or great grandparents were from Ireland, who have made their mark on this country. So, in my view, you cannot really understand Canada without understanding the Irish in Canada. You can say it's true as well of other groups like the English and the Scots and the French and the Italians and the Portuguese and the Chinese and African Americans. They all need to be taken into consideration. But I go back to an earlier point that I made. If you're looking at the 19th century, the key ethnic group are the Irish in the key formative period of the country. And in this sense, the Irish become more like a charter group than an immigrant group. They're both, of course, but as a charter group that actually helps form the culture to which other immigrants must adjust. And that is largely a Protestant loyalist culture.
That's fascinating. I got to ask you before we go about a couple of issues. Tell us about hurling.
Okay, you should have my friend and colleague Pa Sheehan come in and tell you about hurling, since he is a hurler. He's in the Celtic Studies program, and he's a hurler, and he organizes hurling matches, plays in hurling teams. It's really taken off.
You can take a stick or like a
yes,
and
yes.
beat people with it. Is that correct?
No. You're not supposed to beat people with it. But you score, you bounce the ball on the stick and you run with it and you pass it, and it's very very fast and very very skillful, and it can be, and it's a thrilling game, absolutely thrilling game to watch, and it's, you know, at the speed of hockey, uh, really, the ball moves very rapidly from one side of the pitch, a long pitch, to the other. It's quite something. I highly recommend to anyone listening, to go to Google and to just type in Ireland hurling final 2024. It's a phenomenal game. It's really, it goes into extra time. It's a nerve tingler right to the end. It's an amazing sport.
Tell me about the Book of Kells.
The Book of Kells is on display at Trinity College in Dublin, and it's an ancient manuscript that was actually rescued from, brought into Ireland to save it from the Vikings. It is a stunning piece of artwork. Um, and whenever you go to, when I was doing research in Trinity College Dublin, the archives
It's
there,
a
be
book
sure to
that's
sign up
like
with people to
several
see it.
yards long, correct?
It is, and the artwork is it's absolutely, it's intricate. It's and there are all sorts of hidden things in there. I mean, another friend and colleague from Celtic Studies, now retired, Anne Dooley, uh, used a segment from the Book of Kells and a cover of a book that she wrote and edited, and what she hadn't noticed and what no one noticed until it was pointed out was, when you look very carefully, there's a little man with an erect penis in the corner. You know, you think, so all sorts of things like this in the Book of Kells, sacred and occasionally profane. But I'll say this too: if anyone's interested in looking at the Book of Kells, you know, I could say go to Trinity College in Dublin. They turn a page each day, and you can see it. But you can also see it in Toronto. You can see a beautiful facsimile of it, of the entire book, in the Kelly Library at St. Michael's College. You'd need to get permission from the librarian to see it, and you'd be supervised while seeing it. But there's nothing to stop you once you have that permission from looking at a brilliant facsimile of the Book of Kells.
We're chatting with David Wilson about St. Patrick's Day and Irish Canadians. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is David Wilson, a history professor at the University of Toronto, an Irish Canadian who's written numerous different books and articles and been teaching for a long time about Ireland and Irish Canadian issues. I want to ask you to close, if I could, sort of two questions, Professor. First is Ireland's turned itself around. It's an economic powerhouse, and that's kind of surprising. How and why? And then number two, I was thinking that, you know, in this time when Donald Trump and other people are so negative toward refugees and immigrants and migrants, is there a story that we need to learn from the Irish Canadian history?
Yeah, there's a story we need to learn from the Irish history. Certainly, I'll come to that in a moment. Um, how did it happen? Well, I'll just preface this by saying the transformation in Ireland between the 1950s and now is is extraordinary. From one of the most socially conservative Catholic countries in the world to one of the most secular and progressive countries in the world. And economic transformation is a crucial factor in that. And Ireland really benefited immensely from joining the common market in 1973, that then became the EU. And because here you had a low tax base, and people who spoke English. This is ironic given the consequences of the waning and in some cases suppression of the Irish language. But the English language is a huge draw for American tech firms and drug firms and pharmaceuticals and so on to get into the European market. And the government has had very, very low capital gains taxes undercutting other countries who were really pissed off about this, undercutting them to keep on attracting American investment. And in my view, disastrous decision of the UK to leave the EU benefited Ireland greatly because Ireland was now even more attractive as a place from which to enter the much greater European market with about 500 million people. And the wealth that has poured into the country as a result of this has been unprecedented, extraordinary.
And great education. Is that not?
Oh yes, yes, absolutely. I agree. It used to be said in the stereotypes about Irish Catholics. I remember hearing this from an Irish Protestant. I'm not prejudiced. I would, if I was going to hire a barman, I'd hire a Catholic. But if I was going to hire an engineer, I'd hire a Protestant because Catholics, they're not educated in things related to technology. Well, if that was ever true, it's definitely not true now. Education is at a premium. Absolutely. But
So we've only got a minute left. Is there a lesson?
At the same time, the other part of your question, within the EU, there's been a great deal of emigration into Ireland, and that has caused friction. In November of 2023, there were major riots in Dublin against immigrants, and there is a strong sort of white supremacist minority within Ireland. It is a minority, and it has to be reckoned with. There's a lot of anti-immigration sentiment within Ireland, which is another great irony because Irish people abroad were subjected to a great deal of anti-immigration sentiment as well.
David Wilson, thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving us a history lesson on Irish Canadian history. I really appreciate it. It's a great way to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, sir.
Thank you.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Happy St. Patrick's Day.